208, bro. There are parses out there floating on the week 1 PTS for the pure class Dragonknight hitting over 200,000 DPS. And in this video, you'll see my parse where I hit 208k.
Huh?
Sounds insane, right? Well, that's because it is. It's not legit. The DK isn't broken in the way that you think. It's literally bugged. Don't fall for it. I just wanted to make you aware. In this video, we're going to go over those fake parses and show you how they're bugged. But more importantly, we're going to talk about what the DK actually looks like on the week 1 PTS and talk about the changes that are necessary to make the pure class DK viable when this all goes live. The bug that we're seeing on the Dragonknight right now is something that conceptually I could actually see existing as a real playstyle in the future. Now, the DK just received changes to nearly its entire toolkit, skills and passives. It genuinely feels like a brand new class. One of the biggest changes that we've seen is to Engulfing Flames, which is now Engulfing Dragonfire, a 4.8 second channel that ramps in damage over its duration. Now, the bug that we're seeing for the Dragonknight is related to this ability. Conceptually, I could actually see it existing as a real playstyle in the future, but it's very specific. If you light attack and recast Dragonfire with 1 second or less remaining on its duration, the channel stacks on top of itself up to 3 times, and it will also allow you to cast other abilities while the channel continues, and that's clearly unintended. As goofy as that sounds, it's worth stopping to look at what this creates from a gameplay perspective. Class identity has been one of ESO's biggest struggles for the last few years, largely because most classes end up playing the same way. ... spam, spam, spam. Now, before subclassing, multiple classes even shared identical mechanics. Examples might be the bow style-like procs from skills like Relentless Focus or Bound Armaments, or the short 6-second dots like Daedric Prey and Power of the Light, all of which pushed rotations towards the same rhythm. Ironically, this bug accidentally creates one of the most distinct class-defining rotations that we've seen in a long time. To maintain the rotation properly, you need to recast Dragonfire once every 3 skills, very similar to how Blast Bones works, and still maintain a regular rotation with the Nightblade bow proc of sorts and Molten Whip. And this isn't just bow procking every X amount of skills though, it's every 3 DK skills, which requires a different level of planning and tracking. On top of that, Dragonfire cancels if you bar swap before casting another front bar ability, which fundamentally changes decision making. You may reapply certain front bar dots early, consume Whip earlier than planned, or add Magma Fist, a competitive spammable for the DK for even more added complexity. And at its core, channeling a Fire Breath ability while maintaining a genuinely complex rotation just feels good. Now, to be clear, there is essentially zero chance that this specific implementation ever makes it to the live server. It's a bug. And bugs like this almost always come with some unpredictable side effects, particularly related to server performance. That said, way back in the early days of ESO, light attack weaving itself was discovered as a bug, or so I've heard, before becoming a foundational part of the game's combat system. I don't expect this Engulfing Dragonfire bug to survive, but I would love to believe that there's a future where a deliberate, polished version of this playstyle could exist. And unfortunately, that's about the most optimistic outlook that I have for the Dragonknight right now. The class still needs a significant amount of work before it goes live, so let's dig into the real question: where do all of these changes actually leave the DK in practice? I spent the entirety of the last video breaking down every individual change to this class in detail. That full breakdown is linked in the description, but here we're going to focus specifically on how these changes apply to the DPS spec of this class, and we'll save an analysis of the DK's support specs for the next video. The most interesting part of the DK's current outlook is that the class is now essentially impossible to subclass in any meta-capable way. This feels intentional and likely represents an early look at the future of the class system and how it relates to ESO combat. If that is the case, I'm a bit concerned at where the Arcanist sits in the priority of this rebalancing effort. I'd like to see Herald of the Tome nerfed as these class reworks continue so that we don't end up with another 4 years of Arcanist dominance, though conceptually, I do think that this combat direction is the right one. The reason the Dragonknight can't be subclassed is because each of its 3 skill trees now contains something uniquely integral to the DPS rotation. Ardent Flame houses some of our strongest damage tools, namely Molten Whip and the burning passive Fan the Flames. Whip's damage scaling through Seething Fury can now be built by casting any Dragonknight ability, meaning a fully stacked Whip occurs far more often in a pure DK setup, pushing it to become one of, if not the single strongest ability in the kit. Burning damage is also a major contributor to the DK DPS and is maximized by slotting up to 5 DK abilities per bar. which in practice means that we want at least 5 on the front bar alone. Dragonic Power is now where the DK's primary ult, Dragon Leap, is kept, and this is now the strongest ult in the entire game. Dragon Leap increases our damage done to monsters by 20% for 15 seconds and only costs 125 ult. A couple of our stronger abilities are kept here as well, Talons and Dragonfire, and this tree gives us 7% damage done, with damage over time effects by 7%, thanks to our World in Ruin passive. Damage over time effects in a pure DK setup make up the largest percent of our damage output, so this passive is essential. Finally, Earthen Heart contributes more raw DPS than any other tree, at minimum through Shatterspike Mantle and Molten Weapons, but more importantly through Avalanche, now one of the strongest passives in the game, granting 10% increased damage done. This passive is easy to overvalue on a dummy and becomes more fight dependent in raid scenarios, which we'll talk about later. Because the damage value of the Dragonknight is so evenly dispersed across all 3 trees, running only 1 or even 2 of them is inherently weak, even when paired with currently meta subclass options. To maximize DK damage, you need all 3 trees working together, which is why a pure Dragonknight setup is now clearly the strongest way to play the class. Long term, this is a very healthy direction for class design. Unfortunately, it does nothing to solve the short-term problem of the beam meta that's been suffocating endgame raiders for the last 3 years. And on top of that, there's one more major issue. Right now, engulfing Dragonfire, the 4-second channel, is significantly stronger than the higher APM whip build. Our fire version of Fate Carver has already been seen hitting as high as 158k, which means that it will likely push into the 160s, while the best Whip Parse so far just barely cracks 143k. To be fair, with all the animation changes on the PTS, weaving is currently bugged and feels a little off. The audio and visual cues many of us rely on for light attacks are misaligned, and when you combine that with the PTS lag, virtually nobody is weaving below 0.05 right now. That impacts Whip Parses far more than Dragonfire Parses, but even accounting for that, I don't realistically see Whip climbing much past 150k in its current state. Now, let me be clear, builds like Fate Carver and even builds like the Heavy Attack Sork should absolutely exist and even should be competitive. You should be able to clear 95% of content in the game with easier lower APM builds. The problem is that ESO has increasingly allowed these low APM rotations to not just exist, but to also become the most optimal choice for damage, and that's backwards. Easier rotations should not be rewarded with more power. Higher APM, more complex rotations should always deal more damage, rewarding players for their time, effort, practice, and simply mechanical skill. This really shouldn't be controversial, and it's one of the biggest reasons the endgame side of ESO has declined so rapidly over the years. There needs to be a middle ground where all of these options exist, but where complex rotations make a comeback and are properly rewarded. And with that said, the whip builds for the DK are the most like old ESO I've seen in a long time. The 10-second Dragonfire and Claw timers combined with the 4-second Talon timer create an extremely fast-paced rotation that already struggles to line up cleanly with our 15, 20, and 30-second dots. Now, if Magma Fist were buffed slightly, you'd end up with a rotation that has an insane number of overlapping timers to track, plus a 3-stack bow proc style mechanic that doesn't play like bow proc at all. Easily one of the most difficult rotations I've ever tried to maintain. Rotations like that should come with more power and more reward. To close out my feedback on the week 1 PTS, here are my biggest takeaways. First, Dragonknight cannot be viably subclassed, which makes pure class setups the most optimal way to play it. And that is a positive direction for combat long term. Second, we still need a short-term solution to the stale meta that's plagued endgame raiding for the last 3 years. I've been saying this from the beginning, make DK meta for Season 0, then when the Warden comes out, make that the meta in Season 1, and you know what, if nerfs are needed later to make those swings possible, simply communicate that clearly to the community. I've compared ESO to World of Warcraft a lot lately, simply because that's what I've been spending my time in, but one thing that WoW does exceptionally well is it shifts the combat meta frequently and predictably. Changing the meta is healthy, and nerfs don't have to feel bad when the direction is clear and upcoming changes are communicated ahead of time. Now, third, please continue to offer low APM builds like Dragonfire so that players have accessible options. But fourth, reward high APM, more complex rotations by making them more powerful. And again, to be crystal clear, that doesn't mean nerfing Dragonfire, it means buffing whip builds. Now, finally, all of these changes have resulted in the most class identity that we've seen for any single class in a long time, and the ceiling is still so much higher. Look at the Dragonfire bug, and if I can make any plea to the devs, it's to allow this bug to inspire creativity within the world of what's possible to truly continue to make each class feel unique. So to close out this video, I want to show you the 3 rotations that we're currently working with: the 141k pure class Whip build, the 157k pure class Dragonfire build, and the 208k bugged Dragonfire build, mainly because I really just hope that this playstyle inspires an intentional implementation in the future. Now, before we look at those rotations though, let's quickly go through each Dragonknight skill tree and highlight the most important skills and passives now that so much has changed. Starting with Ardent Flame, Molten Whip is currently our strongest spammable. You can run Magma Fist as your primary spammable and then only cast Whip at 3 stacks of Seething Fury, and that will produce nearly identical damage, but it's significantly more complex to execute. And spamming Whip on its own tends to just be a tad stronger. The other Whip morph, Flame Lash, which turns Whip into an AoE spammable against off-balance enemies, is unfortunately very weak and not competitive. Incinerate, which was formerly Flames of Oblivion, is the strongest dot in the DK kit right now, dealing nearly as much damage as the full set Null Arca, while also providing our major crit chance buffs. Searing Claw is currently our second strongest dot. Now passively, Traumatic Burns increases flame damage enemies take by 5%, while Fan the Flames dramatically increases burning effectiveness, boosting its application chance by up to 100% and its damage by up to 50%, scaling based on the number of DK abilities that you have slotted. In practice, I'm seeing Burning tick for roughly 10k DPS, which again puts it close to Null Arca in damage. If you're getting about 9 to 10k DPS with Burning, you can even justify swapping a Flame enchant for a physical damage enchant instead to apply Sundered. Moving on to Draconic Power, this tree now houses the strongest ultimate in the game, Take Flight, which increases our damage done to monsters by 20% for 15 seconds at a cost of only 125 ultimate. Engulfing Dragonfire is the primary spammable used in the 157k Dragonfire build, functioning as a channeled spammable, while the other morph, Disintegrating Dragonfire, is a dot that applies burning and deals a decent medium amount of DPS, still absolutely worth running. Burning Talons remains one of the DK's strongest abilities, roughly tied with Incinerate, and it also applies burning. Passively, World in Ruin increases damage with dots by 7%, which is extremely important given that dots make up the largest portion of the DK's damage profile. This is this tree's only true damage passive, though it's also worth mentioning the Storm's Voice, which restores health, magicka, and stamina whenever you consume an ultimate, with those resources being restored based on the amount of ult that you spend, and that further scaling in value the more DK abilities that you have slotted. Finally, Earthen Heart is almost entirely focused on amplifying our damage. Magma Fist is another spammable option that currently is slightly weaker than Whip, likely because of its Heat Shock debuff that replaces Stagger. Heat Shock increases an enemy's damage taken by 99 for 10 seconds when stacked 3 times. If Magma Fist receives even a small buff, it will likely become the primary spammable, with Whip only used at 3 stacks of Seething Fury, though that isn't the case yet. Molten Armaments provides our major weapon and spell damage buffs and causes light attacks to deal an additional 1640 flame damage on a 2-second cooldown. In real damage terms, this skill produces a medium level of DPS, slightly less than Dragonfire, but again is absolutely worth running, especially in Whip builds where we're weaving constantly. Shatterspike Mantle is our weakest dot in terms of raw damage, but it increases our damage done by 100, making it effectively equivalent to the Heat Shock debuff from Magma Fist. The wording on this buff is a bit ambiguous, but the impact is very real, and it's clearly worth slotting. Shatterspike also grants a free stack of Avalanche once every 10 seconds, helping accelerate this otherwise slow passive. And that brings us to the Avalanche passive itself, which is arguably the strongest passive now in the entire game. Whenever you deal damage, you gain a stack of Avalanche, increasing your damage by 1% per stack, up to 10 stacks. You can only gain 1 stack every 5 seconds though, and failing to deal damage for 2 seconds causes you to lose a stack. That means that Avalanche takes roughly 50 seconds to fully stack on its own, or closer to maybe 30 to 40 seconds when Shatterspike is slotted. And this is frankly a bit extreme. This passive will be far less valuable in short fights and is going to cause the DK to look a little bit better on the dummy than in real raid encounters. The duration simply feels excessive, and this is something that I think should be revisited. Finally, Blessings at the peak generates 3 ultimate whenever you cast an Earthen Heart ability, occurring up to once every 6 seconds. This further increases the value of Magma Fist, since the only other meaningful skills that we would cast to proc this passive are 20-second dots. Now, this Whip Parse is probably one of the more complex rotations that we've seen in a while. Managing the 10-second timers as well as that Whip proc makes the rotation very fast-paced and frankly high APM with a lot of tracking components. We want to prioritize that 3-stack Seething Fury proc whenever we have it, ideally without casting other DK abilities so that we don't waste stacks of the build. We still do want to cast Whip as a spammable when we have nothing left to reapply. And maybe the most challenging part of this entire rotation is balancing the priority of reapplication. We have very few dots in this build that simply just act as damage over time effects. A lot of our skills buff our damage, including Volatile Armor, Trap, Stampede, Molten Whip. Balancing when the best time to reapply all of those components versus doing the 3-stack Whip is probably going to be the difference between higher and lower rotations. Now, this parse did hit 141k. There's still some timer mismanagement, a little bit of sloppy parsing and weaving attributed to the new animations, and I even forget to bash with a new mythic for a few seconds here, so I could easily see this rotation capping out at 145 to 150 with some more practice and optimization. Now, as the parse progresses, you'll see that we do, in fact, let some skills fall off, primarily the damage ones, quite a bit more than you would like to see it. The timer management is pretty tricky, but here, as our priority, we want to make sure that Carve never falls off. Then we reapply Trap for minor force, Stampede for its buff, Molten Armaments because it buffs both our light attack damage and gives us our major sorcery and brutality buffs, then Volatile Armor, and then after that, it's just kind of prioritized in order of dot damage. So, Incinerate, Talons, Claw, Dragonfire. The only other real note is we want to try to make sure that we have as many dots up as possible for Take Flight. We're pretty limited in the amount of Take Flights that we can use throughout this parse because of the timing, so if we cast the ult a little late, it doesn't matter too much. It's better to get those dots down. Now, this Dragonfire Parse I find relatively interesting. It plays a little bit like Fate Carver in terms of running abilities to buff the damage of Dragonfire, but otherwise, we obviously don't have to worry about building Crux. We can just use the ability. There are two niche components to this parse. A, we want to try to cast a 3-stack Whip whenever we have it available, but not as a priority over Dragonfire and never in Take Flight. Our second strange rule is during Take Flight, we don't ever want to cast more than 2 dots. As time goes on, we might argue that it's not worth casting anything there, but the reason is because Dragonfire builds in damage over time. However, Take Flight not only increases the damage of Dragonfire by 20%, it also causes each tick of Dragonfire to immediately deal its maximum amount of damage. Now, Dragonfire channels for 4.8 seconds, Take Flight lasts for 15. This means that we can get a little over 3 full casts of Dragonfire at its highest damage dealing capability. Now, that said, Dragonfire will still build in its damage over time in terms of the modifiers, so if Take Flight runs out when we're, say, halfway through, then Dragonfire will exit the Take Flight ramp window halfway through its damage increase, so we'll get the 2 strongest ticks at the end of that. So my thought process was if I reapply no more than 2 dots during Take Flight, the 2 lowest damage hits of Dragonfire exiting this window are going to be buffed. It will ramp so that when Take Flight ends, we're automatically in our 2 stronger ticks of Take Flight. And I found this balance to be a little bit more worthwhile than just letting dots fall off in general. And finally, the super fun, silly, bugged Dragonfire Parse. I really just want to show people this so they can really see what I mean when I'm talking about the play style. Now, the rules for this parse are pretty simple. It's just a straight parse dummy rotation. The only important component is activating the bug early on. Now, remember, the bug is to light attack and reapply Dragonfire with 1 second or less left of its duration. Now, when we do this, there's going to be about a 2-second window where we can't cast abilities. So once I activate the bug, I start spamming my 3-stack of Whip. And then after that, it's fair game. We hit another Whip, light attack into the Dragonfire bug again to keep the rotation going. And then the only other important component is if we bar swap off of Dragonfire, as you'll see near the end of the parse, it cancels the stacking bug. So you have to make sure that you're reapplying Dragonfire with that bug once every 3 abilities. And then you cast a front bar ability so that you can bar swap and reapply the back bar timers. So light attack Dragonfire, skill, 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 Dragonfire, skill, skill, skill. And I think what I enjoy about this playstyle is not only the look of the Dragonfire constantly going through the entire time, but it's trying to play this 3-stack Whip proc with a spammable, with that bar swap component. And it just creates some sort of harmony. It creates a harmony between this channeled style of play with an actual rotation. I think it's really cool. And as I mentioned in the video, if you add, say, Magma Fist, especially if it gets buffed into this rotation, then you have a spammable and a 3-stack Whip that you're trying to play as a priority, casting the 3-stack Whip so that whenever you cast Dragonfire, it builds a stack of Seething Fury, and then balancing that with maintaining Dragonfire all the way through. I think it's a really cool and unique way of playing this class. But as you'll see, we were peaking at near 220k until I accidentally bar swapped, and so we lost a ton of damage from that. Again, this is a bug. It won't go live, but I would love to see this type of bug influence maybe some cool playstyle ideas for this class and others in the future.